Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. And folks, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the show as we explore major trends, technologies, timely news, and strategic, actionable advice for the larger telecom broadband industries. Now, as we maneuver today's conversation, which is an exciting one and has lots of voices coming to the table, I want to make sure you're all caught up on previous episodes and obviously have access to some of the context that we're going to be bringing up. So make sure that you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, that's amphenolbroadband.com for more information on our solutions and services, and also for more episodes of Wavelengths. You can find our video and audio versions of the podcast there on the site. You can also subscribe to Wavelengths on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so just hit that subscribe button, and you'll have a full catalog of previous episodes as well as notifications when we drop new episodes of the show. All right, let's dive in. There's a lot to discuss and a lot of voices to platform today. So today is an exciting episode of Wavelengths, and it's really a first for the show because we're doing our first major roundtable of experts here on Wavelengths. So we have a host of incredible voices weighing in on one of the most important active developments in U.S. broadband today. It's something we've talked on before on the show. We're giving it another round here to close out the year. That's right, we're talking the deployment and execution of federal BEAD funding. So the U.S. Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Funding Initiatives, which is one of many state funding operations to revitalize and expand broadband infrastructure in the United States, has been steadily chugging along all year. Last time we checked in on BEAD funding on the podcast was in March of 2023. So we're just going to assume we're going to do a year in review here, more or less. Since then, we've had major updates to the BEAD timeline. In May, the NTIA issued its notice of funding opportunities for the BEAD grant program. The FCC published its online map of federally funded broadband grant projects for better visibility, In June, the NTIA released its funding allocations for the BEAD program. And then as of basically a day ago, this week, for context of folks listening in here, maybe a little after we record, all 56 states and territories in the United States have submitted their proposals. So we are finally moving into a phase with BEAD where that funding is going to get deployed, and it's going to get deployed thoughtfully. So now it's time to assess where we've come in the last year and what's still left to make best use of BEAD funding. So we want to ask and get some thoughts on what have been success stories from the BEAD program so far. Where have we encountered some challenges in implementation, in oversight, and proper allocation of funds? What are the expected versus the ideal impacts of BEAD and its funding pool once fully deployed and put to work? And with the current crop of proposals out there now from all states and territories, what do we think, right? Are they sufficient? Are they strategic? Are they going to get the job done in expanding broadband access in the United States? Well, we have the pool of experts to give us their analysis today. I'm excited to introduce our BEAD roundtable. Let's go down the line. First up, we're joined by Zach Raley. He's SVP and Advisor to the CEO here at Amphenol. Zach, great to have you on. How you doing?
Thanks very much, Daniel. Appreciate it and look forward to the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining us. And we're also rejoined by two previous guests on the podcast. You may recognize them and their great thought leadership. First up, Mr. Ben Elkins, CEO of AireBeam. Ben, great to have you back. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, Daniel. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm pleased to re-welcome longtime collaborator, Miss Diana Goovaerts, Executive Editor of Fierce Telecom and Silverlinings. Diana, always a treat. How you doing today?
Thrilled to be here today, and sorry in advance if you hear my dogs. Joys of working from home.
We have some flavor and character in the background of the podcast today. I'm always appreciative of some, pet joy. So I love it. Diana, Ben, and Zach, thank you again for joining us on this roundtable. We have a lot to cover and limited time, so let's get right to the meat of it. Again, we've touched base on, we have all proposals in from all states and territories. We've had basically the entire year with major updates, allocation of funds, and now proposals on how to spend those funds state to state to state to territory, right? I want to just start with some general thoughts. Let's get the conversation rolling before I dig in on some specifics. what are y'all's thoughts on, I guess, the general management of the BEAD program, BEAD funds, and kind of where we've landed now with these allocations and proposals for spending said funds? Any initial reactions based on progress over the last 12 months? Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to jump in and just set the stage before I let Ben and Zach kind of take it away with the nitty gritty. Because, right, you guys are providers, you're probably in the trenches, but I can kind of provide some background information from a contextual point of view. So the thing about BEAD is that the states have to kind of go through a process of different drafts of their plans, right? So as you said, Daniel, all 56 states and territories have submitted volume 1 of their draft with the NTIA. That then had to go out to public comment. Then the revised version of that gets submitted to the NTIA for approval. And then they do it all again with volume 2. And that's all before the money can get awarded. And there are, I think, 6-7 states that are at the volume 2 submitted to the NTIA proposal for approval. That's Louisiana, Virginia, Delaware, Kansas, Nevada, and I think Vermont. Once that's approved, those states can go ahead and start their competitive bid process. And that's the process through which operators will go ahead and submit some proposals. They'll get scored by the states, and then the states will decide who to award the money to. And the timing of this podcast is actually perfect because we just had our U.S. Broadband Summit in Washington, D.C. last week, and some of the key issues that we've been hearing around BEAD include making sure that the states get enough applicants in the first place for the BEAD funding, making sure that those applicants are qualified, and also making sure to smooth the path for applicants. So not putting so many requirements in the state plans that they create new roadblocks for operators who are already facing things like permitting issues and pole attachment issues. So that's some of the stuff we heard along with workforce issues. But I'll leave it to Ben and Zach to kind of chime in from the operator perspective for sure.
Yeah. I'll jump in from an Arizona perspective, which where AireBeam hails from. Even though we are in different states, our headquarters is in Arizona. And from a perspective here, one of the great things I think that BEAD did was the challenge program, being able to challenge on the map. Some of the LECs were less than ethical on what was served and what was underserved. And I think that, for instance, in Arizona, just through the challenge process, there was another $180 million found magically through the challenge process, which greatly enhances the state's ability to do what we're supposed to do, right? Get the underserved served. So I think, in Arizona, we're almost to $1 billion. And so almost 20% of our funds were through the challenge process. So I think that was a great addition from the extending the process, I guess.
Mm.
No, and maybe, Diana, just to maybe clarify. So I'll bring a little bit of different flavor to this because we're a heavy supplier into the actual equipment and hardware that's going to enable a lot of this. And, from just a high level perspective, right? I mean, the BEAD Act is the largest infrastructure act as part of a large infrastructure, but it's the largest infrastructure act for wired sort of connectivity since the Roosevelt 1938 Rural Electrification Act. It's a huge amount of money. I think it's a needed amount of money across much of the rural space. So it's going to be a very dynamic time. We are in, me personally, I'm in nearly weekly discussions with the NTIA on how this deployment is going to be enacted in terms of what's going to go in from an equipment perspective. And that's actually, to your question, Daniel, I think it's a big challenge because if we had to say today, in a typical fiber build, which, the NTIA and certainly the Office of Budget has been very direct in indicating the preference for fiber optic deployment. We can talk about the effectiveness of that or the reality of that, certainly through the podcast. But I do think that, if you had to say, turn the switch on today, start building plant, couldn't happen. The product is not really ready in terms of the ability to meet the requirements of the Build in America aspect that the Office of Budget is mandating for much of this. There are some waivers that have come out. So we hear from many of our operator partners that that's a big challenge. And, particularly in the side of electronics, and certain of the optical transport equipment, there's going to be a lot of heavy lifting that has to get done relatively soon to make this happen if the builds are going to start in 2024. So we've been very active along and with partnership with a lot of our service provider customers on how do we help the government officials create a policy around the actual deployment of equipment that is going to be effective. As you might imagine, we've been deploying equipment for much of the current build structure for maybe the non-rural areas, some rural areas, certainly in RDOF, that have been not subject to some of those Build in America requirements. So it's going to be a challenge to essentially shift a very significant portion of that supply chain away from some of the overseas structures that exist today into a deployable structure that we can make at or inside the North American market, and particularly in the United States, to be able to do this. There's been a lot of investment that a lot of people are doing that's been very forward. Companies like Nokia building factories to help with some of the optical transport equipment, et cetera. And I think that'll be a significant challenge, right? You've got the labor challenge, which you mentioned earlier, which maybe Ben could comment on. That's clearly going to be a challenge, but it's great. It'll be great to have people to build it, but if you don't have equipment to put up that meets requirements, you're probably not going to do much in terms of expanding your network. So.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in, but the timing of that comment is also perfect because, to your point, Zach, like a ton of folks, you had mentioned Nokia is bringing manufacturing of certain components back to the U.S. to comply with those Buy American requirements. For people who don't know, that means that I think it's 55%, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 55 or somewhere thereabouts, has to be made in the U.S.
Correct. Yeah, 55% U.S. component content, and it has to be manufactured, i.e. it has to come out of the door of a U.S. facility. Those are the general requirements under the BABA Act, which is the Build America, Buy America Act. But then there are some waivers that sort of are shifting a little bit, nuances that are going to come out of that that are sort of a bit of a moving target. But we're trying to help certainly the government offices to really make sure that we can not be a gating factor in terms of the equipment that goes into this. But there are a lot of that's sort of the high level. But there's going to be some variability based on the fact that if you had to do that in certain instances, you'd never have a product going out your door. So, you got to, I think there's some significant and very thoughtful processes going on right now, particularly at the NTIA, to make that something that, is not going to be a gating factor as we try to launch this program.
And that's something as a trade journalist that we've been hearing a lot about the back and forth between you guys and the NTIA about, is this even feasible? Nokia, STL, I think Ciena just came out with a domestic manufacturing thing, Corning, CommScope. It's stuff that, everybody's really trying to address. So this isn't just kind of like a background issue. This is actually at the forefront of, even if the money is awarded, they can't start building these networks without the equipment that complies with that funding requirement. So this is like a major issue that nobody knows about unless you're in the industry. So to anybody listening, pay attention to what's going on in this space for sure.
Yeah.
And Zach, to your point there, we actually even had to switch gears and pick different vendors than we normally would have.
Sure.
Because of that. And we started doing that, 9 months ago, just in preparation, even though out here in a couple of states we're going to be in, Arizona, Utah, and a couple others, it may not start till 2025. We figured we needed at least a year and a half to get ready. You're
absolutely right. I mean, if you think about that the entirety, let's just talk kind of pre-BEAD. So pre-BEAD, for a fiber heavy deployment, I wouldn't say that the vast majority of the product came from overseas. You're probably at an 85 to 87% level of all of the stuff that came from an overseas perspective, just because of the way global supply chains had been migrated over the years. So you're requiring a pretty big shift to enable that to come back to the United States. There's certainly some governmental logic to it, right? I mean, the fact that you can use BEAD as the starting point to make more indigenous capability from a product standpoint, and sort of initiate that for then, what will be probably, I don't have a great word for it, but let's call it the fiberification of the North American communications infrastructure, where, right now you have kind of blended architectures. And then in the future, you want to migrate essentially the entirety of the U.S. network to a fiber optic platform because it is the fastest and probably is the future of communications for many applications. So there is some logic to it. So I think this starting of this process does have some long-term health for the industry, and certainly to de-risk some of the globalization issues that are certainly coming to the forefront in today's world. So I think you're right, Ben, that the reality of having to start thinking about that now, I know everybody is very much true. And we're, as a company, we're significantly considering, dramatic shifts in production locations and certainly a lot of investment in the U.S. market in terms of manufacturing. So it's something that we're all faced with, and, we're probably going to have to do as this gets rolling.
Would love to hear more about that, Zach.
Interesting.
Yeah, let's further pick at this larger kind of supply chain or sort of cross. Yeah, it's cross industry, but almost like cross sub industry coordination that needs to happen to make sure that once proposals are accepted, once build out of infrastructure actually starts to happen, well, it can happen, right? And so I'm curious what y'all think are some of the major. Beyond the sort of, Buy America layer of all of this, what are some of the supply chain challenges, the kind of coordination between manufacturing entities, public entities, the equipment suppliers, the utilities themselves? What are some of the challenges in that coordination that y'all have found have really reared their heads as everyone is trying to align and get their ducks in a row in anticipation of building out these projects? And any thoughts on how to turn those challenges into solutions?
Well, I guess I'll start on this one. I think right now is a heck of an opportunity because a lot of the providers out there, whether they want to admit it or not, money is tighter from an operator standpoint. So what's happening right now today is there's less fiber builds being built right now than say there was a year ago. So what's happening is there's actually a surplus of equipment on the fiber side, conduit side, stuff like that. What I have been doing is doing a stockpile because the price points right now are incredible for conduit, fiber, different things, vaults, pedestals, stuff like that. And I'm trying to create like a little arsenal, I guess you could call it, in my warehouses. So not only will I be prepared if I'm lucky enough to win some of the grants, but if not, I know I'll be able to sell it or whatever down the road. But I think right now is a really good opportunity to get ahead of it because I do think sometime, I don't know if it's going to be mid next year or when, there's going to be that the pricing is going to go up and there's going to be a shortage of this equipment and supplies. So I think right now is definitely a great opportunity. Tough to challenge that with the cash flow is tighter, right? So there's a difficult road you have to walk down. But if you have some CapEx money available, I think that's a definite well good spend right now.
Hey Ben, from an industry perspective, right? You've got kind of an interesting, I wouldn't call it a dichotomy, maybe a trichotomy, right? Because you have the traditional, what you might consider a tier one, right? An ILEC, a Comcast, a Charter Communications, that may be Cox. You've got a sort of the secondary layer of the smaller players, Lumens of the world, and that. Then you've got municipalities, smaller companies, maybe even towns and electric co-ops. So you've got this very interesting dynamic developing about who's going to build these networks. Do you think that aside from the big folks in that sort of, let's call it tier 2, tier 3, maybe even tier 4 layer, is there going to be an advent of capital flow that comes out of VC, venture capital, or private equity that sort of looks to say, hey, we could get into some of these markets exploratorily because it's going to create fragmentation, right? You're going to have significant fragmentation of new players in the market space. What do you think? Because again, to your point on funding and the tightness of capital, right? As interest rates start to come down, and they will, you're going to see probably some movement in terms of where that capital could come from. But, being on the offside, what do you think is going to happen within that funding space for sort of some of the, call it mid to smaller players that might be going after some of this market?
Well, Zach, there's a lot of smaller guys that are very, very worried about the capital constraints because a lot of the big VC guys are ponied up already with your tier ones, right? Your Comcast, your AT&Ts, your Coxes. I don't even consider Lumen part of that, kind of. Mm-hmm. So, but the smaller guy is definitely going to have to go to get some private equity money, and I think they will be able to get that because I agree with you. I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, the interest rates are going to start to come down, and then they'll be able to get it more affordable to get involved in this. That's the only way they're going to be able to compete, though, because there is this is a very expensive game, but I do think they're going to have to partner up, because if they try to do this on their own, they're not going to be able to come up with the match, and then they're not going to be able to fund this. And
Sure.
it's going to be very, very, I think it's going to be very much more competitive than people think. And you're going to need a lot of capital to not only to deploy it, but to deploy it right, and also have the backing that the states and the NTIA want, and just have the bond amounts. And it's not a game for the weak at heart. So to your point, I think they're going to have to find your partner. And you're going to have to find your dance partner somewhere out there, and that's going to be in the VC. And I think a lot of that mid tier, I worry about the real small guy if he's going to have a chance, Zach. I really do. I think that a lot of it's going to depend on the relationships that you develop with your broadband director of your state, because if you have not done that and you've let the middle guys or the tier ones build that relationship, because they want to spread it out to all. I think in a perfect world, they'd like to have 2 or 3 projects for 8 or 10 companies or whatever it is. But if you haven't built that relationship with that, and you're a small guy and you're tight on funds, I think you're in a big disadvantage.
Yeah, sure.
Well, and there's another factor at play too, right? So it's not just that you need the money to deploy it. You also need to make sure that you have good enough financial backing to maintain it going forward. So a lot of these builds are going to be taking place in low density rural environments, and those just don't have the ROI. So unless you have a really solid business or the financial backing from a private equity partner to help you manage that going forward, that can be an issue. Also, the fate of the Affordable Connectivity Act could also influence this. That is making sure that a lot of lower income people stay connected via that $30 a month subsidy. If that goes away, and these folks build out to all these places, and then suddenly nobody can afford to connect, what's the point? So, I mean, that's another whole other discussion about what needs to be done beyond deployment. But I think one of the other threads I wanted to kind of pull at, if you'll humor me, Daniel, is just the idea of timelines, right? There are so many moving parts and so many moving pieces. So it's not just the timeline of the manufacturing that needs to be pulled back stateside. It's also the financing element that Ben talked about. It's also the workforce element. So last week at our US Broadband Summit, some of the folks were talking about how they're already training workers, but they're finding either that the operators just aren't hiring because they're waiting to see whether or not they win money, or operators are hiring, but they're hiring out of state. So states are training up all these workers and then they're just leaving and going elsewhere. And so the timelines of all of these giant pieces of the puzzle have to come together. And it is one heck of a juggling act. Let me tell you, the NTIA certainly has their hands full. State broadband offices, heaven help them, because some of them that were on stage said their office consists of 3 people. So this is not a small undertaking, and it's being done by a handful of people who are probably working their hearts out.
I was just going to make a quick comment about the labor. I think that's a key point. And I'll just quickly on the labor piece. With Davis-Bacon, prevailing wages also is going to make it a huge challenge. In a lot of states, they're not used to paying those kind of wages. So to be able to afford to pay those wages and be compliant under that is going to be tricky. I think you're going to have to do some sort of hybrid. That's what we're planning anyway, to where you're going to have some of your own staff, no matter where it is, because it's so rural, because it's going to be tough to find labor in some of these rural areas. You're going to have some of your own team along with the contractor element. If you don't do both, I think you're going to be really against the 8 ball, because I think it's going to be really, really hard to make this all work, pencil out financially, and even possible to get people to go out in the middle of Timbuktu to hit certain areas, right? If you don't have your own team. So.
No, and it's interesting. I think a corollary to sort of the labor side, though that's very labor related, is that if you look at the success, and let's call it success, of the RDOF program, which didn't have certainly the supply chain issues. It had some of them just in terms of ramping back into normal supply chain from the COVID era. But the reality is that, there was definitely a squeeze that happened even with a very less significant pool of funding. What we did see in that environment is two really interesting things. One, the challenges of getting overhead pole attachments became really a major gating factor in terms of getting new fiber attached to poles that electrical utilities owned or municipalities may own. And that actually drove a very interesting dynamic that we didn't expect to see. And that is a lot more underground installation than was expected, as we went into the RDOF program. So, there's some significant nuances. Ben, you mentioned, putting conduit in stock and all of that, significant nuances to building an underground versus an aerial plant. The fact that you've got electric utilities probably bidding on some of this fiber architecture, they own the pole, they're bidding on it. Are they going to be a problem in terms of getting attachment? There's some interesting dynamic there that could drive certainly some, need for, do you need people that can work in overhead trucks? Do you need people that are familiar with trenching? Those are aspects that I think are going to be very interesting from a labor force standpoint. But I think, Diana, to your point, what is interesting is the stickiness in the rural markets is, from our operator folks that we work with, the stickiness when they deploy in the rural markets is like 2 to 2.5 times higher in terms of initial pass rate penetration in a rural build than they see in a normal suburban build. So what does that tell you, right? When they're getting between 65 and 85% penetration on pass, that tells you there's something that's really needed, right? When people are like, they go into even if it's like 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 homes a mile, their rates of uptake are just dramatically better. And actually the hold rate in terms of churn is there's no churn because there's no other option, right? So I think you're going to, how much of that is driven by, the subsidy, $30 a month subsidy in terms of allowing people to get access versus, it's kind of like a utility, right? You got to have power and you got to have water. In today's world, you got to have internet. So you have to wonder how that's going to, create some interesting dynamic as we see that. But clearly, everybody who played in RDOF saw some really positive results. Obviously funded on the back of enabled on the back of government funding, but certainly in terms of what they normally saw in terms of uptake and retention rate, that's pretty promising, I think, for the long-term success of the program.
Just to your point about pole attachments, yeah, really interesting. I am super interested to watch how the landscape changes because a ton of electric co-ops have been getting into the broadband game. That's been something we've been watching on Fierce Telecom. But also, it's not just about pole attachments. The other big issue, the other big gating factor, as you put it, has been permitting.
Sure.
And the thing is, I was talking about teeny tiny little state broadband offices. Talk about teeny tiny little towns. They might have one person who is the clerk and the, fire inspector. These are not big towns. They don't have a huge amount of municipal staff or resources to process all these permits. So I think that beyond just the state broadband offices, states are going to have to think long and hard about the resources that they allocate to local municipalities to help field some of these permits that are coming in, to help those officials actually understand what's being put in. I used to be a community reporter up in New Jersey before I got into the broadband industry. And, you would sit through a public meeting and they're talking about cell towers or, a broadband bill. They don't know what this is. And that's not, that's not talking down about anybody, but I didn't know either before I got into broadband. So I think education is also going to be key, as well as some staffing resources or some sort of resource to help local municipal officials get through the permitting process.
I'm going to jump in here, if you don't mind, and just pick at that a little bit, because it seems like we're coming back around often to the people that are going to make this happen. Workforce development, training, coordination. Identifying slices of the infrastructure build out pie that just don't have the proverbial manpower to make it happen. And I want to use this as kind of like a bridge into talking about, Diana, like you just mentioned, specific state funding and allocation, right, of said funds intentionally across different slices of building out broadband intentionally. States are approaching that differently. Obviously, again, we have all 56 states and territories with proposals out there. I'll bring up two examples to just kind of foster discussion. But for example, in Arkansas, they're going to utilize, or they plan to utilize, their around $1 billion to not only obviously allocate funds to serve inadequately connected areas, but also expand their Arkansas Fiber Academy, which is specifically for skilled worker development. So Arkansas has got that in mind there, right? In Florida, for example, they took advantage of, Ben, what you brought up earlier, the challenge process to designate copper line broadband areas as underserved. And then they have a method to reclassify locations as unserved based on speed tests. So they can then prioritize those for fundings. So there's just some examples of how states are strategically trying to maneuver, taking those funds and deploying them correctly where they're most needed. So, not only just on the workforce side of things, but just in general, what are y'all's reactions to some of these proposals? If you have any specific examples of ones that stand out to you, or that, for good or bad reasons, feel free to pitch them. But even just generally, do you feel like these proposals are laying out funding plans that are making best use of these dollars to address all the challenges from supply chain to workforce to coordination to literal just, equipment build out that we've been talking about here today? What are y'all's thoughts?
I'll go ahead and jump on this one. So, from a perspective on what I've seen is, first off, you got to have extra money right out of the pool to do some of these cool things, right? And some of the states have done this, and it was really brilliant. They extended out the process, right? So if you remember when this started, a lot of folks thought that BEAD would be kind of being awarded next month or, 2024 January. Them extending this out a whole year, in some cases longer, what it's done is, like, let's say, for instance, let's use the state of, Arizona or Texas or whoever. I know, for instance, in Arizona, I believe that next year at this time, when it'll start getting awarded in December or January, I believe 10 to 15% of the map will be taken off by people getting itchy trigger finger and going ahead and saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and build in that area and take it right off the map. So you're talking about 100, 150, $200 million off that the state then can use for cool projects like you said in Arkansas for training, or maybe building infrastructure highway and helping, different, whatever the project is for that state. I think that as an operator, I didn't love seeing it because you're watching a lot of the BEAD just go away. And I'm guilty of it too. But at the same time, it's really cool for the state's perspective of helping out the state and having extra funds for some of the cool projects that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think certainly from a state perspective, right? I think the example of getting ahead of the labor curve here is going to be really important. Don't lose sight of the fact that BEAD is important, but it's actually a part of a much larger funding act under the Infrastructure Act. And there are other networks, in particular the EV charge network, that are going to suck people away, right? I mean, it's not the same skill set, obviously, but if you're training people to build, the next 400,000 EV chargers at site stations and gas stations and municipal areas, it's a huge amount of people that are going to have to build and go into that environment, and they're going to be competing, right, with folks that may be looking into the BEAD environment. So getting ahead of that training curve, where clearly today there will not be enough people. There's just no question in my mind there are not going to be enough contractors, installers to do this, and I think that that's going to be a really critical part. I think, Diana, your point is, how do you start putting all of this together? I would say that the process of, the feds coming up with the program, getting in the states getting applications in, I would say that's actually been moving kind of according to schedule. But all the stuff that has to make it happen once they say you're approved, you're going to get the money, right? From there forward, I think we're probably in a bit of a lag. I think there's not, we've sort of been very focal on, not we, but we as a country have been very focal on, sort of getting these applications in and, figuring out who it's going to be. The states will then go back and start making their decisions on who gets what. That'll get finally approved. But then it's a matter of, what do you got to do to make it happen? And I think there is some lag that we're going to see, certainly across many of these areas, whether it be labor, supply chain, and certainly the ability to attach or get permitting, to the point, Diane, you made earlier. It's just, there's not, because again, think about it, right? I mean, if you went back to Roosevelt era, 1938, when they started the rural electrification program, I would guess there's exact analogs to this whole process, because the reality is you went from essentially not having anything to having to build it all out in a very compressed time period with lots and lots and lots of miles to be built. That's just, we're not prepped for it. That's just in reality. So it's going to take a lot of lifting at the state and local levels to really make this happen.
Yeah, and if you'll allow me to toot Fierce Telecom's horn here, we actually just partnered with TIA. We're going to be launching a workforce development portal called Broadband Nation with them. Again, this is to kind of educate people. So, it'll have videos showcasing what does a fiber splicer even do? Kind of let people know what it's like to be a broadband technician, a day in the life of. It'll also help coordinate job listings and certification programs so people can see what's available near them, right? So not all of these programs are available in every state. Some states have their own programs. And so what we are trying to do working with TIA is kind of help connect people to those resources, because as you said, Zach, there's going to be a huge shortfall. There's something like 200,000 jobs that need to be filled in order to make BEAD happen. And without some sort of coordinated effort, it's just not going to come together. And one of the other things that we heard at our recent summit was that states are taking different recruiting paths. So they're going after military folks. They're starting apprenticeship programs. They're looking at tribal populations to kind of help them. And then they're also going to in the prison systems. And one of the problems that they found there is that some operators would not like to hire those people. And in some states, you can't ask that question on your job application, and on others you can. So figuring out where all of that comes together is its own problem. But yeah, to Zach's point, it really needs to kind of be sorted through, and there needs to be a coordinated effort on the forward-looking stuff, not just the immediate getting money out the door, because yeah, you can get the money out the door and then it's going to sit there. So got to look ahead a little bit.
Ben, what are your thoughts on, sort of as we get into this, the willingness at the federal and state level to maybe say, you know what, we just can't do this with a straight fiber build. We got to go to different technologies, right? Whether those are point-to-point wireless, 5G deployments. What's your thought about the loosening up of sort of the very fiber-focused effort? Do you think that's a reality, or is it a real challenge?
It's funny you mentioned that. So I have many talks with our broadband director in Arizona, and we also in Utah. And Arizona is a very diverse state as far as terrain goes. In Phoenix or Tucson, it's very flat and very, urban-like. You get in rural parts, it's very mountainy. Flagstaff, Sedona, White Mountains. And I've always been curious, are we going to be able to do fiber in certain areas? And, that you go down a trench in 1.5 mile road to get to one house. Now, does that really make sense? And for the last year and a half, I've heard, oh, yeah, we're going to do fiber. And then all of a sudden, the last 90 to 120 days, this fixed wireless component comes in, and it's it's going to happen. So for us, we are prepared for it. We have a segment of our business that is fixed wireless. It's not a product that I would say is my gold standard product at all. But at the same time, we're going to make it one that, it has to be, when I compare it gold standard versus like a fiber, like it's not ever going to give out 5 gigs or something like that. But at the same time, it's the only way the state's going to be able to provide high speed internet to rural folks. So the money would get chewed up if you'd have to, because at the end of the day, you have to be able to provide internet service to every single home, or theoretically give that option. And so it's a reality. It's going to happen. And I think it's going to be somewhere around 10-15% of the build outs are going to be at that. So that's what we're prepared for. And, it wasn't something I was prepared for, though. If you had asked me this, Zach, in June, I would have said you were crazy. But now it's a reality, and it's going to happen.
How about, because you mentioned it, Diana, just briefly, but, not a big aspect, but a meaningful aspect of, this whole funding act is the tribal nation enablement for broadband, but also what the USDA is doing in the agricultural space, right, for large scale farms and, grow operations. Because in your state, you have a lot of both of those, right? You have a very significant tribal nation population. You also have a lot of agriculture in Arizona. Do you see any of that dynamic starting to flow in terms of people questioning about how that might work in terms of those two aspects?
So, on the tribal side, that's an interesting one because the tribal side, they want to partner with companies. So because they're going to be funded, whether it's BEAD or through the other grants, they're going to have funding. And I think there's an opportunity there. I actually do. And I'm actually one that's engaging and going to try to work out something with that. So I like that, especially in certain segments. Now, the only difficult part is sometimes with the tribal is political, and sometimes it's tough to make a deal with them. But and they definitely want to be, say, a 51% owner in that component. So there are some different elements, but the cool thing is almost every deal I've ever done with in that segment, they want the workforce will be there from the tribe. So you can recruit from the tribal community. So that eliminates, because a lot of times you're like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to serve this community properly? Well, you can get the workforce from that community. You can train them up from there and you have your workforce built in. And like Diana mentioned earlier on the ACP, it's a $75 rebate from the tribal side. So your ARPU is going to go up to 75 instead of the 30. So that's attractive to an operator too. Now there are 101 challenges with providing fixed wireless service in the middle of, like a Navajo Nation in Arizona or in Oklahoma and in Cherokee Nation or whatever. But that being said, if you can get over some of the obstacles there, I think there is a business model that pencils out.
So then let's end on a more actionable note then. We've I think landed at the conclusion, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that BEAD funding in terms of dollar amount is useful. It can be strategically deployed, even if considered maybe not enough. It is enough to do something, to move the needle in a positive direction. But there are still major buckets of the equation that there just aren't key solutions for yet. How are we going to fill 200,000 jobs to make BEAD funding happen? How are we going to prepare the supply chain for movement of equipment and goods to actually build out the infrastructure? How are we going to make sure to educate all needed parties on, especially public servants, on how to make sense of implementing this infrastructure thoughtfully and in an informed way? So where would each of y'all put the most focus in terms of the, short-term action plan strategies, right? Where does the industry need to find some consensus and really put their energy to prepare for the future of BEAD, for the next year of development, of deployment of funds, and of, hopefully the fulfillment of actually connecting the U.S. with some broadband?
I could go pretty quickly and succinctly. I would probably say workforce efforts, first and foremost, to get the networks actually deployed. And secondly, I would say outreach, whether that's digital literacy efforts, whether that is making sure people know what fiber is and why it's important and what it can enable, or even just broadband generally, in fact. I think that'll be really important because some of the people who aren't connected choose not to be connected. Whether that's because they don't know how to use the internet or because they just think they don't need it. So I think education, digital literacy, and in terms of deployment, workforce development will be key to making BEAD a success going forward.
Off the grid, Diana. That's what they want to be, off the grid. I would just say from our perspective, a lot of what Diana said, the labor force is a concern. I think you're going to have to do a hybrid model of make sure you get your contractors ahead of time and get them locked in. And then as far as beefing up your own construction and installation team, and then be it like Diana mentioned earlier, you have to be able to service them for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years and have a plan for that. It's one thing to get the money and then deploy it, but how are you going to operate it afterwards? So you got to have a plan for that. From a perspective from the government, I hope that there is some, I want to say leniency, but some cooperation with things like NEPA and the environmental studies and stuff like that, because that can hold up things for years. Supposedly that's going to be on the permitting and NEPA side, that's going to be addressed, and they're going to be working with us. So, I mean, to do this in a timely fashion, those things can be really, really ugly and really, really long. And I'm not saying going and destroying the Grand Canyon or anything, but what I'm saying is, have a situation where it's a working relationship with the environmental folks and the NEPA studies and stuff like that. So I think if we can work as a team, environmental, labor, construction, government, everyone works together, I think this could really work out, and I think it'll be great for the community. And like Zach mentioned before on the supply chain, making sure that you plan for this, I think that's huge. I think getting your stuff now is better than waiting, because I do think, Zach mentioned earlier, I think it's a real thing, whether it be fiber or pole attachments or vaults or pedestals, whatever it is. I think you better prepare now, because I think there could be a shortage of that later on. And so,
no, from the equipment side, I think getting the guidelines really pinned down, whether they're challenging or not challenging, just knowing what they are is going to be really helpful. And, being able to then say, okay, we now know what the game plan is in terms of having to meet the rule set that certainly the Office of Budget puts out. That'll be really helpful for the suppliers across the entire space to be able to say, okay, now I know what I need to do. Let's start to get this aligned so we can get it set up for, I would say initial deployment coming mid-20, not dramatic increases, but certainly initial deployment starting in 2024. So getting that done, which I know, the folks at the NTIA are very, very keen to do here very, very soon, will really help the supply side start buttoning down and figuring out how we're going to make this happen. But it'll certainly be interesting to see where that all goes.
And there's obviously still so much to come. I mean, if anything, we've been at this for a while now with BEAD and with other sort of, state-funded broadband infrastructure build-out projects, and we're just now getting to the point where we can start to visualize building them out. And yet it almost feels like the challenges are just starting. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we're bound to have more conversations here on Wavelengths where we open up discussion and do more of this strategic, actionable, open-ended forums where we can find some consensus and hopefully give our audience of pros in the industry some tools to get out there and build that consensus wherever their slice may fall in the larger telecom industry. But till then, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's roundtable here on BEAD funding, BEAD updates. Where have we come from? What's the current state of it? And what's on the horizon? So thank you again to the three of y'all for such a great conversation. I mean, it's a good conversation when the host gets to sit back and listen. So I had a great time just enjoying, y'all's analysis and crosstalk. So thank you for coming so prepared and for giving our audience something juicy to chew on. I'll go ahead and wrap things up with just some opportunities for y'all to pitch yourselves here. So Diana, if folks want to learn a little bit more about Fierce Telecom, y'all's partnerships now as part of this larger program, or just get in touch, how can they do so?
Yeah, super simple. Head over to fiercetelecom.com. My email address is dgoovaerts@questx.com. You can also check out our cloud-focused site, which is silverliningsinfo.com. We would look forward to seeing you guys on the site.
Love it. Ben, same question to you. If folks want to learn more about AireBeam, their rollout in Arizona, or just get in touch with you for some thought leadership, how can they do so?
Yeah, you can go to AireBeam.com, go to our website. We're part of Boston Omaha Broadband, which is Boston Omaha Corp. We have 3 other sister companies that are all over the country. So AireBeam's expanding all over the U.S. and we're really excited. And we do it in a very regional and a specific industry-wide. So love to talk to folks about that, and either LinkedIn or our website. I'm always easy to talk to, so you guys can reach out.
Love it. Last but not least, Zach, if folks want to learn a little bit more about Amphenol and its role as, one of the leading suppliers of key equipment for this next phase of BEAD infrastructure rollout and development, how can they get in touch? How can they learn more about you and your work?
Sure. Our Amphenol Communication Solutions Group, very visible on the web. Certainly just Google it and come up. Drop me a line, zraley@amphenol.com anytime. And, our dramatically large U.S. footprint for our manufacturing locations for all of this stuff is something that, we're already in process on, not only currently operating today, but expanding pretty dramatically. So we're going to be ready for that curve when it hits. And I think our alignment with all the great folks at the NTIA have been really helpful to give us some guidance, is going to get us ahead of the game. And we're happy to help support this. It's, we're looking forward to it, but it's going to be some challenges to get this thing rolling. But I think when it's full steam, you're gonna see it. I'll close with saying, you think about it this way. There's 22 to 25 million completely underserved Americans for broadband access. What we're going to do in the next 3 to 5 years is essentially build another Comcast or Charter. That's what we're doing. And they have probably 1.4 million to 1.5 million miles of plant. That's the scale. But the scale actually may be more because you're in a rural area. It could be 3 million miles of plant. So it's not small, and it's going to be an interesting ride, and certainly one that's going to have its ups and downs, but it's a massive opportunity for the industry, and I really look forward to being a part of it.
It's an exciting time to be in the industry, that's for sure. Diana, Ben, Zach, thank you again for your time here on Wavelengths. It's been such a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. If you like what you heard and saw today and you want to be part of the next roundtable, you want to make sure you don't miss out on future updates to BEAD, or just tap into larger thought leadership here on the development and evolution of the telecom industry, make sure that you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, amphenolbroadband.com. And make sure that you're subscribing to Wavelengths on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and wherever you get your podcast content. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. We'll catch you on the next episode of Wavelengths.